Why won't this master key open your car? This is a violation. That was the first thing I heard at 7:12 in the morning on what should have been a peaceful morning. I stepped onto my porch with coffee still steaming in my hand, only to find a woman I had never met hunched over the driver's side door of my truck, jamming a shiny brass master key into the lock like she was defusing a bomb. She spun toward me with theatrical outrage. All vehicles in this neighborhood must allow HOA emergency access. Your refusal is highly suspicious. I had not said a single word. When her magical key failed again, she gasped dramatically, whipped out her phone, and dialed 911 right in front of me. Hello. Yes, there is a non-compliant male preventing a mandatory HOA safety inspection on his vehicle. She pointed at me like I was a car thief. What she did not know was that the non-compliant male she was reporting was the county sheriff. Before we get into this unbelievable story, let me tell you that what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about HOA presidents and the lengths they would go to enforce imaginary rules. I had dealt with unreasonable people before because it comes with a badge, but nothing prepared me for the level of creative nonsense this woman managed to weaponize on a daily basis. And the funny thing is, before she tried to unlock my truck with a so-called master key, I genuinely believed she was just another overly enthusiastic HOA president with too much time and too many clipboards. I had been wrong before, but never this spectacularly wrong. My name is Robert, and I have been the county sheriff for over 20 years. I have seen drug busts gone wrong, domestic disputes that escalated to violence, high-speed chases through rural highways, and standoffs that lasted for hours. But nothing in my entire career prepared me for the absurdity of dealing with Karen Allen, the self-appointed guardian of neighborhood harmony and the unofficial commissioner of vehicular compliance. To understand how we got to the moment she called 911 on the county sheriff, without realizing it, I need to take you back a few years to the day I first moved into this quiet little cul-de-sac at the edge of the HOA jurisdiction. My house sat on the border of their governance close enough that Karen could see it from her kitchen window, but far enough that she technically had no authority over any square inch of my property. And that technicality was the single greatest frustration of her entire personality. She could not stand that I existed just beyond her reach. She could not accept that my driveway, my lawn, my mailbox, and most importantly my truck, were all outside the invisible fence of her clipboard kingdom. Before we go any further, if you believe that people like Karen should not exist or need to be held accountable, then subscribe to this channel, because we provide daily Karen stories that will satisfy your need for justice and change the way you see neighborhood conflicts forever. Trust me, you will want to stick around for what happens next, because this story only gets more unbelievable from here. The very first time Karen introduced herself, she did not say hello or welcome to the neighborhood. She did not bring a casserole or offer to help me unpack. Instead, she marched up my driveway with a clipboard tucked under her arm like a prosecutor getting ready for trial. Her orthopedic sandals clacked against the concrete with the rhythm of an approaching storm. Her hair was pulled back in a severe ponytail, and her eyes scanned my property like she was cataloging violations in real time. Law enforcement vehicles may cause unnecessary alarm, she said while nodding toward my patrol cruiser parked in the driveway. I will need you to park that elsewhere. Somewhere residents cannot see it. It makes people nervous. It took me a moment to process the absurdity of the request. I explained politely that the cruiser was legally registered, legally parked, and legally immune to her personal discomfort. I told her that as the county sheriff, I was required to have my vehicle accessible at all times for emergency response. I kept my voice calm and professional, even though my instincts were screaming that this woman was going to be a problem. She forced a smile that did not reach her eyes. The corners of her mouth turned upward, but her pupils remained cold and calculating. She made a note on her clipboard with a flourish of her pen and walked off like she was filing paperwork for my eventual eviction. I watched her go and felt that familiar tingle at the base of my skull, the one I get when I know trouble is brewing. And that was just the warm-up act. A few days later, I found a piece of paper taped to my cruiser windshield. In bold letters, it read unauthorized government imagery visible from public view. $45 fine. I stared at the paper for a long moment trying to understand what I was reading. Government imagery. She meant the sheriff badge on the door, the official emblem of the county that I had sworn to serve and protect. She was trying to find me for having a badge on my patrol car. I actually laughed out loud right there in my driveway at 6:30 in the morning. It was so absurd that laughter was the only reasonable response. I peeled the paper off the windshield and tucked it into a folder. At that time, I did not know just how thick that folder would eventually become or how many categories of nonsense I would have to create for the avalanche of future offenses. Little did I know that folder would grow into multiple binders, filling an entire shelf of my home office. Over the next year, I received an unbelievable range of HOA citations that were not actually citations at all. They were just pieces of paper she had printed at home on her personal computer. They had no legal standing whatsoever, but she handed them out like parking tickets at a shopping mall. Once, she tried to fine me for leaving tire tracks in the driveway after a rainstorm. She called them unauthorized terrain modification. Another time, she accused me of visual intimidation because she did not like how the sun reflected off my truck's chrome grille. She said the glare was aggressive and made residents uncomfortable during their morning walks. I received a citation for parking too close to my garage. I received one for parking too far from my garage. I got fined for having a vehicle that was too tall and then fined again for casting a shadow that was too long. She measured that shadow with a tape measure and documented it with photographs. She actually got down on her hands and knees in my driveway to measure the length of my truck's shadow at various times of day. But the moment that really set her off, the moment she transformed from nuisance to self-proclaimed regulator of my existence, was when she asked me to provide the HOA with a copy of my car keys for emergency purposes. I was on my porch drinking coffee when she approached with that request. She presented it like it was perfectly reasonable, like she was asking to borrow a cup of sugar. She explained that the HOA had implemented a new emergency vehicle access protocol and that all residents within visual range of HOA property were required to surrender duplicate keys for community safety purposes. I looked her dead in the eye and said, absolutely not. Not a chance. Not in this lifetime. Not in any alternate dimension where the laws of reason still apply. She blinked, stunned that anyone would deny her. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. No one had ever refused her before. She was accustomed to people folding under the weight of her clipboard and her stern expressions and her relentless citations. She was not prepared for someone who understood that her authority was entirely fictional. Then she cleared her throat, lifted her chin, and replied with chilling determination. We will revisit this. And I should have known right then and there that those 4 words meant trouble, because Karen did not make threats. She made promises, and she was not the kind of woman who let things go. Fast forward to the morning, she jammed her brass master key into my truck door and called 911. That is where we started this story, and that is where everything began to unravel for Karen and her imaginary kingdom. When my deputy Ray arrived on scene and revealed who I was, Karen froze like a computer buffering after a critical error. Her face went through 17 different expressions in the span of about 3 seconds. Confusion, denial, fear, anger, more denial, a brief flash of defiance, and finally something that looked almost like embarrassment. She eventually stormed off in humiliation, muttering about jurisdictional technicalities and emergency protocols that superseded conventional authority. But humiliation for Karen was not a deterrent. It was fuel. She did not see her failure as a reason to stop. She saw it as a reason to try harder. And that is what made her so dangerous. By the next morning, the first signs of escalation appeared. Bright pink flyers were taped to every mailbox, every lamp post, every trash bin in the neighborhood. They were impossible to miss, partly because of the glitter glue she had applied liberally around the borders, and partly because of the hysterical all-caps title. Urgent community action required. Stop the non-compliant vehicle. She had even added tiny stars around the heading, as if she was decorating a bake sale poster instead of launching a campaign against the county sheriff. The flyer accused my truck of being a community risk. It claimed I had refused to participate in HOA-approved vehicle safety protocols. It insisted that residents must vote to require all neighborhood vehicles to provide universal HOA access credentials. In other words, she wanted a key to everyone's car. My neighbor Mark knocked on my door that afternoon holding one of the flyers. He was a middle-aged accountant with a perpetually tired expression that had only grown more exhausted since Karen took over the HOA 3 years earlier. He rubbed his temples as he spoke. "Is this about you?" he asked. "Apparently," I said. He groaned deeply. "She fined me last week because my car was too red. She said it was visually aggressive and could trigger emotional disturbances in sensitive residents. I had to park around the corner for 2 days until she calmed down." I was not surprised. Karen's interpretation of HOA rules had never been grounded in anything resembling reality. She invented violations the way other people invented excuses for being late. But this new crusade was on another level entirely. She was not just harassing individuals anymore. She was trying to mobilize the entire community against me. Later that evening, I found a bright yellow notice tucked under my windshield wiper. Notice of parking violation. Excessive vehicle presence. $65 fine. Excessive presence in my own driveway. I had parked in the same spot I had parked in every single day for 3 years, and now suddenly it was excessive. I added that paper to the growing binder. The following day, she held what she called an HOA emergency meeting. Someone recorded it on their phone and sent the video to me, possibly as entertainment and possibly as evidence. I watched it on my laptop that evening and felt like I was watching a parody of a political rally hosted by someone who had read half a textbook on leadership and decided she was ready for world domination. Her presentation included a pie chart showing my truck as the #1 cause of community instability. She had labeled the chart Neighborhood Threat Assessment, and my vehicle occupied 87% of the pie. The remaining 13% was divided between aggressive lawn ornaments, unauthorized bird feeders, and non-compliant mailbox colors. She showed a blurry photo of my vehicle taken from a suspiciously low angle, like she had been crouching behind a bush to capture it. The photo made my truck look ominous and massive, like some kind of mechanical monster lurking in a suburban driveway. She had clearly edited the contrast to make it look more threatening. Then came the slide titled Potential Threat Indicators. The list included size, color, reflectiveness, authority symbolism, owner non-compliance, and driveway positioning. She had created a scoring system where each factor was rated on a scale of 1 to 10, and my truck had scored a 57 out of 60. Apparently the only thing keeping it from a perfect score was that I had not yet installed flashing lights on the roof. She concluded her speech by declaring that the HOA must take immediate action to restore driveway harmony. The phrase driveway harmony became her new battle cry. She repeated it 4 times in her closing remarks and even suggested creating a subcommittee dedicated entirely to monitoring driveway conditions throughout the neighborhood. One resident raised a timid hand and said, "Is that not the sheriff's truck?" His voice trembled slightly, like he knew he was about to poke a hornet's nest. Karen snapped back with venomous certainty. "Authority does not exempt anyone from community standards. The law applies to everyone equally, especially those who believe they are above it." To be honest, hearing her say that made me laugh. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. She was lecturing about equality while simultaneously running a one-woman authoritarian regime based entirely on rules she invented herself. I could not make this stuff up if I tried. But the laughter did not last long. By the next morning, 3 new notices appeared on my truck: reflective paint disturbance, unauthorized law enforcement symbols, driveway shadow imbalance, driveway shadow imbalance. She was now fining me for the shape of my truck's shadow. The citation included a hand-drawn diagram showing where the shadow fell at various times of day and how it allegedly encroached upon the collective harmony of the neighborhood. That was when I realized this was not just another HOA spat. Karen was escalating towards something much bigger: much louder, and far more absurd than anything I had seen up to that point. She was not simply annoyed by my truck. She was obsessed with controlling it, controlling me, controlling everything she believed fell under the spirit of the HOA. And the real kicker, my driveway was not under the HOA at all. I was completely outside her jurisdiction. But that little detail meant nothing to Karen, because in her mind, jurisdiction was a matter of interpretation, and she was the ultimate interpreter. Knew I needed to start documenting everything meticulously, not as a neighbor, but as a sheriff. I had seen enough cases fall apart due to insufficient evidence. I had watched guilty people walk free because prosecutors could not prove their case. I was not going to make that mistake. I began gathering photos of every flyer and notice. I saved screenshots of her emails. I recorded her meetings when they were posted online. I collected statements from neighbors who also felt targeted. I made copies of the so-called master key guidelines she claimed to enforce. I was not building a case out of spite. I was doing it because I could see exactly where Karen was heading. She was marching straight toward a legal collision. She just could not see the cliff edge because she was too busy looking at her clipboard. And just when I thought she could not possibly get any more irrational, she proved me wrong. The next morning, I stepped outside and saw 26 small neon orange flags lining my driveway in two perfectly straight rows. They looked like a weird ceremonial runway leading to my truck. Each flag was stuck into the ground at precisely the same angle with exactly the same spacing between them. The precision was almost impressive in its obsessiveness. Each flag carried the same message written in permanent marker. HOA claim pending. Vehicle access gate under review. A gate. She was planning to build a gate across my driveway to control vehicle access. The footprints around the flags were hers. I recognized the pattern immediately. Those orthopedic sandals never lied. The distinctive tread pattern was as unique as a fingerprint, and I had seen it pressed into my lawn more times than I could count. I crouched down and looked at her handiwork. The flags were arranged with mathematical precision. She must have spent hours out here in the darkness measuring and adjusting until everything was perfect. And that is when I realized something important. Karen was not just reacting anymore. She was planning. She was strategizing. She had declared war, and she had absolutely no idea she had just crossed the worst possible line. The legal one. I stood there staring at the neat little rows of neon orange flags, each one stuck into the soil with almost obsessive precision. The early morning sun lit them up like runway lights guiding an airplane onto a landing strip, except instead of a plane, they guided anyone's eyes straight to my truck. It was dramatic, it was ridiculous, and it was undeniably Karen. I bent down and plucked one of the flags from the ground and read it again just to make sure I was not hallucinating. HOA claim pending. Vehicle access gate under review. A gate across my driveway to regulate access to my own vehicle. This woman wanted to control when and how I could use my truck. She wanted to decide whether I could come and go from my own home. I took a long, slow breath and let the absurdity settle in. Karen did not just dip a toe across the line this time. She sprinted past it and kept running like she was training for the HOA Olympics. Her latest stunt did not just feel invasive. It felt strategic. It felt planned. She had probably spent half the night lining up these flags or muttering rule numbers that did not exist. She probably believed she was laying the foundation for a new era of community control. A new dawn of vehicular harmony. I was not angry. I was not even annoyed. I was fascinated because when someone starts behaving this bizarrely, you get that instinct. The same one that kicks in while questioning a suspect who is about to incriminate themselves without realizing it. Karen was not sabotaging me. She was building my case for me. Every flag, every citation, every midnight visit to my property was another piece of evidence in a growing mountain of documentation. Still holding the flag, I pulled out my phone and photographed every angle. I captured the footprints, the spacing between flags, the position of the flags relative to the driveway, the property line markers that clearly showed she had crossed onto my land. I took close-up shots and wide shots. I documented the time stamp and the GPS coordinates. This was not paranoia. This was procedure. And it would come in handy later when the real authorities, The ones who actually had jurisdiction looked into this. Right on cue, my phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Mark, the neighbor who had complained about Karen fining him for having a red car. His message was simple but panicked. "Dude, check your driveway. She has lost her mind." I replied with the photo of the flags. His response came back instantly. "Oh my God, she is making runways now. Is she planning to land a helicopter? Is she expecting aliens? What is happening?" I actually laughed at that. Mark had a way of cutting through the tension with humor, but the morning comedy show was not over yet. A few minutes later, I heard the familiar clack, clack, clack of Karen's sandals marching down the street. I did not have to turn around to know it was her. Her footsteps were as recognizable as her voice. Rhythmic, purposeful, relentless. She appeared at the bottom of my driveway with her clipboard hugged against her chest like a holy artifact. Her blazer was perfectly pressed, and her fake earpiece was back. She had probably spent the night practicing her speech in front of a mirror. "Good morning," she said with a voice tight with fake politeness. "I am sure it is," I replied while still holding her neon orange flag like evidence. She adjusted her sunglasses and lifted her chin. "I see you have discovered the preliminary markers. The HOA has initiated a vehicle access evaluation for community safety. This is standard protocol for non-compliant vehicle situations." "On my property," I said flatly. "Property lines," she said while waving a dismissive hand, "are fluid when it comes to safety concerns. The community's well-being supersedes individual claims to territory. This is basic civic responsibility." I raised an eyebrow. "Fluid?" "Yes," she nodded sharply. "And as acting HOA president, I have full authority to take precautionary measures when a resident refuses compliance." She nodded toward my truck. "And your vehicle's defiance is well documented." I almost choked on my own air. My truck's defiance. A truck cannot be defiant. A truck is an inanimate object. It does not have opinions or attitudes or rebellious tendencies. "It refused universal access," she said, as if that sentence made sense in the English language. "It resisted the master key. That is textbook vehicular non-compliance." I let the silence sit for a moment, mostly because I could not decide which part to address first. Eventually, I gestured at the flags. "You put these here yourself." "Of course I did," she said proudly. "The board was unanimous in their support. This was a collective decision made for the good of the community." My eyes narrowed. That was a lie, or at least a major exaggeration. I knew the board was tired of Karen's antics. They had whispered complaints to me behind her back. They had exchanged knowing glances at neighborhood events. Some had even apologized to me directly for her behavior while promising they were trying to rein her in. "Is that so?" I asked. "Unanimous?" Well, she shifted slightly. "Unanimous in spirit." Our spirit, the best friend of anyone who did not actually have votes, the rallying cry of tyrants everywhere who could not get legitimate support for their schemes. I took a step toward her, polite but firm. "Karen, this is private property. You are trespassing. And these flags, this gate you are planning, have no legal standing. You cannot restrict access to property you do not own." Her chin snapped upward defiantly. "Not yet." That made me pause. Not yet. The words hung in the air like a threat wrapped in a promise. She was not just reacting to my resistance. She was planning something bigger. Karen clutched her clipboard like a shield. "I will be drafting an amendment for the next HOA meeting. The community will vote to place all vehicles within visual proximity of HOA land under shared authority. It is progressive. It is necessary. It is the future of community governance." "It is illegal," I countered. She brushed off the comment with a scoff. "Laws adapt. Communities evolve. What seems radical today becomes standard tomorrow. History is on my side." Then she added almost giddily, "Besides, residents deserve protection from rogue vehicles. Your truck has terrorized this neighborhood for long enough. Its reign of chaos ends now." My truck was now a rogue vehicle, a terrorist machine, Marvelous. I wondered what she would call it next. A mechanical menace, a driveway dictator. The possibilities for absurd terminology seemed endless with Karen. I took another photo of her standing proudly among the flags. She was practically posing, her chest puffed out, and her clipboard raised like a scepter. She looked like a general surveying a conquered battlefield, except the battlefield was my driveway, and the conquest existed only in her imagination. Karen noticed the camera and stiffened. "What are you doing?" "Documenting," I said simply. She frowned, recognizing that word as one that could be used against her later. Documentation implied records. Records implied evidence. Evidence implied consequences. Even Karen understood that much. "You cannot intimidate me," she snapped, though her voice wavered slightly. "I will not be threatened by someone who thinks he is above community standards. Your badge means nothing here." I smiled patiently. "Karen, I think you are forgetting something." "And what is that?" "You called 911 on the sheriff." Her face flushed pink with either anger or embarrassment. I could not tell. Maybe both. The memory of that humiliation clearly still strung. She had spent weeks rebuilding her confidence after that incident, and here I was reminding her of it. "That was a misunderstanding," she said quickly. "A simple miscommunication. Anyone could have made the same mistake." "You told dispatch I was refusing an HOA inspection." "I stand by that. You were refusing." "You told them I was suspicious." "You were suspicious. You were standing there watching me with coffee in your hand. That is surveillance behavior. That is predatory observation." "I was drinking coffee on my porch at 7 in the morning." Her lips pressed into a thin line. It was clear she did not enjoy the memory of her humiliation being brought up. Without another word, she spun on her heel and stormed off, leaving me with a driveway full of flags and the distinct suspicion that this was far from over. And I was right, because that afternoon, while I was returning from town, I saw a tow truck parked suspiciously close to my driveway. The driver stood next to it, scratching his head and looking at a paper in his hand like it was written in ancient code. He seemed confused and uncomfortable, like he knew something was not quite right about this job. I pulled up and stepped out of my vehicle. "Hey there," I said calmly. "Everything all right?" He looked at me, then down at the paper, then back at me. His expression shifted from confusion to concern. "A ma'am from the HOA told me this truck was abandoned and needed removal. Said it had been sitting here for weeks without moving. Said the owner had fled and left it behind as a nuisance." I exhaled slowly. Abandoned. She said it had not moved in weeks. Said it was a safety hazard blocking emergency access. "I drove it yesterday. I drive it every day. It has never been abandoned for a single hour, let alone weeks." He blinked, rapidly processing this new information. She also said the owner was refusing to comply with safety checks and might become hostile if confronted. I pointed to the sheriff emblem on the door of my truck. The gold star gleamed in the afternoon sun. "I am the owner." The man's face drained of color, like someone had pulled a plug and let all the blood rush out. Oh man. She did not mention that. She definitely did not mention anything about law enforcement. I am sure she did not. That would have made the lie harder to sell. He folded the paper and shoved it in his pocket like it was cursed. He could not get away from it fast enough. "Sorry, sir. I am leaving right now. This never happened. I was never here. Sorry to bother you." He climbed back into the tow truck and took off like he was fleeing a crime scene. The engine roared and the tires kicked up gravel as he disappeared down the street. I watched him go and felt a strange mix of amusement and concern. I looked at my driveway, the flags, the disappearing tow truck, the growing ridiculousness of the entire situation. This was not just pettiness anymore. It was escalation, deliberate, calculated escalation. Karen was not just trying to control my vehicle. She was trying to create a narrative in which I was the problem, the danger, the threat. She was manufacturing a reality that did not exist and trying to convince everyone around her to believe it. And if there is anything I know after 2 decades on the force, it is that when someone builds a false narrative, they eventually back themselves into a corner. The lies grow too complex. The contradictions multiply. The house of cards trembles in the slightest breeze. Karen was constructing her own prison, one fabricated citation at a time. Later that evening, as the sky turned orange and purple, I walked back outside and removed every single neon flag. One by one, a quiet, methodical undoing of Karen's imaginary empire. I gathered them into a pile and photographed the empty ground for good measure. Then I stored the flags in a box labeled Evidence Vehicle Incidents, because the truth was clear. Karen was not finished. The master key was just her opening move. The flags were her attempt at expansion, and I could feel it in my bones. She was preparing for something even bigger, something with clipboards, something with signatures, something she believed would finally give her the power she had invented in her head. And I was prepared too. I was ready to meet her escalation with documentation, patience, and when the moment came, the full weight of actual law. Because in this neighborhood, there was only room for one sheriff. And spoiler alert, it was not Karen. I woke up the next morning expecting peace. After the tow truck fiasco, I naively thought Karen might take a day off from her imaginary war. Maybe she would cool down. Maybe she would bake cookies. Maybe she would yell at a cloud. Anything other than targeting my truck again. But the universe had other plans. When I stepped outside with my coffee in hand, I froze. My truck, my perfectly fine, minding its own business truck, was shackled. A giant yellow wheel clamp was locked onto the front tire like some kind of medieval punishment device for naughty vehicles. It was the kind of boot you see on cars that have been illegally parked in loading zones for weeks. The kind used by actual parking enforcement with actual legal authority. And here it was clamped onto my truck in my own driveway. For a split second, all I could do was blink. The bold, stenciled letters on the boot read HOA, impound non-compliant vehicle. There was not enough caffeine in the world for this. I set my mug on the hood and crouched down to inspect the clamp. It was real metal, real heavy, and very much real property damage if she had scratched my rim. The locking mechanism was industrial grade, the kind that required a specialized key to remove. She had not skimped on this purchase. A laminated tag dangled from the lock. I pulled it closer to read the breakdown of charges. Release fee $350 plus, processing fee $25 plus administrative fee $15. Total due $390. Karen really woke up and chose grand larceny today. Behind me, I heard the unmistakable shuffle of triumphant sandals. I did not turn. I already knew who it was. The clacking grew closer and then stopped directly behind me. "Well," she called with her arms crossed over her clipboard. "Perhaps now you will learn to respect community authority. Perhaps now you will understand that no one is above the rules." I stood slowly, trying to keep my composure. "You put a wheel clamp on my truck." "It is not your truck," she snapped. "It is a community-adjacent vehicle subject to oversight. Impoundment was necessary after repeated violations. The board agreed that action was required." I exhaled through my nose the way I do right before reading someone their Miranda rights. "Karen, this is illegal." "No," she corrected while tapping her clipboard. "This is proactive neighborhood safety enforcement. This is responsible community management. You immobilized a law enforcement vehicle. That is a crime. That is tampering with government property." Her eyes narrowed. "A vehicle used to intimidate residents. A vehicle that has caused untold psychological harm to families in this community. Frankly, you should thank me. For committing a crime. For holding you accountable. Someone had to do it. Someone had to stand up for the voiceless residents who cower in fear of your truck's shadow." I laughed, not because any of this was funny, but because I had two options: lose my mind or enjoy the show. And at this point, the show had gone completely off the rails. "Karen," I said while trying to keep my voice calm, "remove the clamp." She recoiled like I had asked her to donate a kidney. Absolutely not. You will pay the release fee just like everyone else. No one else has ever had a boot on their car. Because no one else has ever been this non-compliant. Her voice cracked at the end like she was seconds away from throwing herself dramatically onto the ground and demanding a Netflix documentary about her struggles. Karen, I tried again. You cannot impound someone's vehicle, especially not off HOA property, especially not a government vehicle. This is not your jurisdiction. She smirked with the confidence of someone who had completely lost touch with reality. We will see what the board says. I stared blankly. The board. Yes, she said proudly. They authorized this. They did. Yes, she insisted, with a sharp nod. At that moment, my neighbor Jill peeked out from behind her curtain and made eye contact with me. She shook her head violently. No, absolutely not. The board did not approve this. Her expression was equal parts horror and disbelief. Caught in a lie, Karen pivoted instantly. Well, they did not oppose it. That is not the same thing. It is in spirit, she declared. Ah, yes, the HOA spirit, where reality went to die, where facts were optional and clipboard decrees superseded actual law. I pulled out my phone. Karen stiffened but tried to hold her ground. I snapped photos of the clamp from every angle, close-up of the lock, wide shot of the boot on the tire, detail of the laminated fee breakdown, evidence of any potential damage to the rim. She scoffed with artificial confidence. Oh, please, you think pictures will scare me? No, I said calmly, but they will help the police. Her lips parted in horror. Police, you would not dare. Oh, I dare. I dialed dispatch. Not 911 since this was not an emergency, just the non-emergency line. I requested a deputy respond for unlawful immobilization of a vehicle. Since I was off duty and personally involved, I could not handle it myself. Policy is policy. Karen panicked. Her composure shattered like a dropped mirror. You are weaponizing law enforcement. This is harassment. This is retaliation. You are using your badge to oppress a volunteer community leader. I pointed to the clamp. You immobilized a government asset. You committed a crime. I am reporting that crime. That is not weaponization. That is procedure. Before she could argue further, a familiar patrol cruiser rolled into view. Deputy Hernandez stepped out and took one look at the clamp. Then he turned to me with an expression that said not again. He had heard about Karen's antics at the station. Everyone had. She was becoming legendary for all the wrong reasons. Morning, Sheriff, he said under his breath. Karen, I confirmed with a nod. Karen threw her hands up with theatrical indignation. Finally, someone reasonable. Officer, arrest him for refusing to follow HOA impoundment protocol. He is in violation of community guidelines. He has been terrorizing this neighborhood for years. Hernandez stared at her for a long moment. His face was perfectly neutral, the practiced mask of a law enforcement professional who has seen everything. Ma'am, there is no HOA impoundment protocol. That does not exist. There should be, she shouted. The community needs protection from rogue vehicles. That is not how laws work, he replied patiently. She jabbed her pen toward the clamp. This vehicle is out of compliance. I tried the master key. It refused access. That alone justifies enforcement action. Stop, I said, raising a finger. Do not confess to more crimes. You just admitted to attempting to enter my vehicle without permission. Hernandez sighed and pulled out his notepad. Ma'am, did you place this device on the sheriff's truck? I issued a lawful community corrective action. It was within my authority as HOA president. Did you buy this online? Yes, she said proudly. It is heavy duty. It comes in different colors. I chose yellow for visibility. I also have one in red for repeat offenders. Ma'am, he interrupted, you cannot immobilize property you do not own. This is tampering. This is potentially vehicle interference. This could be classified as vandalism depending on any damage to the vehicle. She gasped with genuine offense. Vehicle interference. How dare you imply that I, a volunteer community servant, would interfere with anything? I am trying to create harmony. He is not implying, I said. He is reading the law. This is oppression. She shrieked so loudly that several neighbors came to their windows. Of the HOA, of community spirit, of everything this neighborhood stands for. If hysterical righteousness were a fuel source, Karen could have powered the entire county. Her outrage was so intense it was almost impressive. Hernandez wrote out an official warning and instructed her to remove the clamp immediately. She refused. He repeated the instruction in a calm but firm voice. She refused again and crossed her arms defiantly. She said she would not be bullied by the sheriff's department. Finally, he said, if you do not remove it, we will, and you will be charged with the cost of removal on top of the other violations. The glare she gave him could have peeled paint off a battleship, but she stomped over and fiddled angrily with the lock. She yanked the clamp off the tire like she was ripping betrayal from her soul. She dragged it away, muttering about tyranny, rogue vehicles, and the death of community values. She left without another word, but her retreat did not last long. 2 days later, she came back with reinforcements. Not people, just paperwork, stacks of it. Glossy brochures she made at home titled the Great Vehicle Harmony Initiative. She taped them to every door in the neighborhood. Some residents found multiple copies on their property. The bullet points in the brochure included mandatory HOA access keys for all cars, HOA-controlled parking rotation schedules, monthly driveway compliance inspections, and fines for visually disruptive automobile silhouettes. She had created an entire manifesto of vehicular control. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. The absurdity was reaching new heights. But Karen was not laughing. She was doubling down. That week I received 13 separate violations. Each one was more ridiculous than the last. I documented them all. Parking too confidently, vehicle presence exceeding comfort threshold, potential intimidation due to height, license plate numerically aggressive, unauthorized reflective surfaces, excessive durability, owner attitude non-compliant, truck windows too transparent, driving patterns unpredictable, tire grooves emotionally sharp, paint color too authoritative, shadow cast exceeds 4.5 feet, sheriff emblem improper for suburban setting. Each citation included a detailed explanation of the offense and the corresponding fine. The total amount due exceeded $3,000. She had invented an entire economy based on fictional violations. I documented everything. I made a second binder, then a third. The evidence was mounting faster than I could organize it. And after seeing me gather evidence, Karen realized something. She was not intimidating me, so she changed tactics. The next escalation came on a quiet Wednesday morning. I returned from the grocery store to find a plywood barricade erected across the entrance of my driveway. It was spray-painted with the words HOA parking zone, authorized vehicles only. Zip ties held it together in a haphazard construction that would not survive a strong wind. A laminated sign hung from the center that read "Violators will be fined." I stepped out of my truck and stared at the barricade. She had actually built a physical barrier to block my driveway. She had crossed from harassment into obstruction. She has lost her mind, I muttered to myself. Then I walked over and lifted the entire structure with one hand. It weighed maybe 8 pounds. She had used the cheapest plywood available, the kind that warps if you look at it too hard. I set it neatly beside a tree with a sticky note that read "Nice decor, wrong house." The next day, a city inspector knocked on my door. He was a tired-looking man in his 50s with a clipboard and a resigned expression. "Got a call from someone claiming there is a dangerous illegal parking structure on this property," he said. Of course she called the city, but she had called about her own barricade. She had reported herself without realizing it. I showed him the makeshift gate. He snorted. "Yeah, no, this is not up to code or reality." He took photos, made notes, and left laughing. He told me he would file a report, but that no action was needed on my part. Karen watched from across the street with her arms folded and her face twisted with fury. She was seething like a kettle left on high heat. She did not speak that day, but her silence was worse. It was calculated. It was focused. I had seen that look before, on people determined to dig their own grave and blame the shovel. I knew then that the wheel clamp and barricade were just the beginning. She was planning something bigger, something more dramatic, something she thought would finally force me to submit to HOA authority. And she had no idea she was walking straight into a legal disaster. For once I did not have to lift a finger. She was going to take care of that all on her own. The strange quiet that settled over the neighborhood after the barricade incident was not comforting. It was not peaceful. It felt like the air right before a tornado touches down. Too still, too heavy, too unnatural. Karen had disappeared for almost 48 hours. For someone who thrived on daily micromanagement, that silence was not a sign of surrender. It was a sign she was assembling her next disaster. And it arrived on the morning of the third day. I opened my mailbox expecting bills or junk coupons or maybe another brochure about lawn fertilizer. Instead, a thick glossy packet slid out with a thud. The cover featured a dramatic photo of a winding suburban street with animated sparkles around parked cars like some kind of magical parking utopia. Across the top in bold lettering was the title, the Community Vehicle Harmony Initiative, presented by Bluff Neighborhood Mobility Council. A council? We did not have a council. I had never heard of any mobility council. Neither had anyone else in the neighborhood. I leaned against the mailbox and flipped it open. The first page had a letter from the desk of Acting Coordinator Kay Allen. Karen had rebranded herself. She had given herself a new title and a new organization. Whenever she reinvented her title, the situation was never good. The letter claimed that due to recent vehicular disturbances caused by resistance to universal access, measures the neighborhood would implement a new set of mandatory regulations. That word mandatory appeared 7 times on the first page alone. She loved that word. The next pages outlined a ridiculous list of rules, each more illegal than the last. All vehicles must be registered with the Mobility Council. Owners must provide an emergency access key upon request. Driveways may be inspected without notice for compliance. Parking zones may be reassigned at any time for harmony redistribution. Unauthorized vehicle silhouette patterns will incur penalties. Vehicle silhouette patterns. A real human being typed that. A real person sat at a computer and composed these words and printed them on glossy paper and distributed them to dozens of homes. At the back of the packet was a payment page, the part she cared about most. Mobility Harmony contribution, fee $89 due within 5 days. She included a QR code linking to a PayPal account named Bluff Vehicle Safety Fund. I laughed out loud right there at my mailbox at 7:30 in the morning like a man who had reached the point where the only sane reaction to insanity was amusement. But when I looked up, I stopped laughing. Because there she was standing across the street by her Prius dressed in a navy blazer and tan slacks wearing a fake earpiece that was very clearly not connected to anything. She watched me read her packet with the expression of someone waiting for praise they absolutely did not deserve. I held up the booklet, a new council. She nodded proudly, formed due to community demand. The residents spoke and I answered. What community demanded this? Residents have expressed overwhelming concern about vehicular chaos. Name one resident. She blinked. Concerns may remain anonymous for safety. I must protect my sources. Safety from what? My truck shadow again. She refused to engage with the sarcasm. Instead, she stepped closer and lowered her voice as if sharing a state secret. Your vehicle has become a symbol of disorder, she said. People are frightened. Children have nightmares. A strong neighborhood cannot function when residents feel threatened by unpredictable silhouettes. My truck had now become a symbol, a silhouette-based threat, A nightmare-inducing machine. Incredible. I flipped the packet closed. Karen, this is fraud. She stiffened. This is community leadership. What you are doing is illegal. What I am doing, she said while jabbing her clipboard toward the sky, is necessary. For who? For everyone. For the children. For the elderly. For the families who deserve to live without fear of non-compliant vehicles terrorizing their peace. The delusion radiated off her like heat from a furnace. Karen, I said calmly, you cannot create fake councils to collect fees. You cannot demand keys to people's vehicles. You cannot find shadows. She smiled, a tight and brittle thing. We will see what the legal advisory panel thinks. Who is on the panel? She hesitated. Me. I almost choked. So you created a council, appointed yourself coordinator, and then created a legal panel which is also you. She crossed her arms. Someone has to take responsibility. And that someone is always you. Exactly. I rubbed my forehead. Karen, do you hear how strange that sounds? I hear how necessary it sounds. This woman needed not an HOA, but a hobby. Maybe pottery. Maybe gardening. Anything that did not involve harassing her neighbors with fictional regulations. Before I could respond, she thrust a clipboard toward me. Sign the compliance acknowledgement. I did not touch it, no. Very well. She scribbled something onto her pad. Refusal to acknowledge. Additional fee $13. Not 10, not 15, 13. Why 13? Because Karen operated on chaos math. She walked off smug as a cat who thought she had caught a mouse. Except I was not the mouse. I was the sheriff, and she was stapling nonsense to her own downfall. Inside my house, I spread everything out on the table. The packet, the fines, the barricade photos, the wheel clamp documentation, screenshots from neighbors who texted me their own violations. There was enough evidence to wallpaper a courtroom. I called the sheriff's office, not as the sheriff, but as a citizen filing a complaint. Since I was directly involved, protocol required that another deputy handle the case. Hernandez, reliable as ever, took the report. Bluff Neighborhood Mobility Council, he muttered. Never heard of it. It did not exist until today, I said. He whistled. She really does not know when to stop. No, I agreed. She really does not. All right, he said. Send me everything. This might cross the line into attempted fraud. I emailed him the documents, photos, timestamps, and links. He thanked me and said he would begin verifying Karen's claims, or rather disproving them. That evening, as I sat on my porch reading through her booklet again and trying to decide whether silhouette patterns should become a running joke at the station, my neighbor Jill approached hesitantly. She looked around to make sure Karen was not nearby. Can we talk? She whispered. Of course. She stepped closer and spoke in hushed tones. We need your help. The HOA board, we are done. We cannot deal with her anymore. She has gone too far. I raised an eyebrow. What happened now? She told the board we needed to create a parking brigade. She wants weekly driveway inspections. And she tried to fine one of the board members because her SUV felt rebellious. Those were her exact words. Rebellious. I rubbed my eyes. I wish I could say I am surprised. She is out of control, Jill said. We have had enough. We want to vote her out. But we need solid evidence. Provable stuff. Things she cannot wiggle out of later. Things that will hold up if she tries to sue the board for removing her. I gestured toward the dining table inside, stacked with paperwork like a crime lab display. I have got evidence. Jill's eyes widened. How much? Binders, plural, 3 so far. She let out a breath like someone who had just seen daylight for the first time in months. This could work, but you have to be there. The board meeting is Friday. We need you to present the evidence. The community needs to hear it from someone with authority. I will be there. She hesitated, then asked one more thing. Is it true she called 911 on you? Yes. and did not know you were the sheriff. Correct. Jill covered her face and groaned. Oh God, this is worse than I thought. I nodded. Yes, yes it is. She left with a promise. The board would prepare the motion to remove Karen. They would handle the procedural aspects. All I had to do was present the facts and let Karen's own actions speak for themselves. But Karen was not going to sit quietly. Oh no, she had sensed resistance. She had smelled rebellion. And like any dictator whose regime was cracking, she ramped up her efforts. The next morning another packet appeared in my mailbox. This one titled Emergency Vehicle Harmony Audit, Mandatory Participation, Required. Inside was a form threatening a $150 non-participation fee. She also slipped a handwritten note under my doormat. I found it when I stepped outside. The handwriting was cramped and urgent. Your resistance strengthens my resolve. The initiative will not be stopped by one rogue vehicle or its defiant owner. Harmony will prevail. Who writes villain monologues to their neighbors? Who sits down at night and composes threatening notes about harmony? The disconnect from reality was staggering. Later that afternoon, a group of bewildered residents approached me. They gathered on my driveway like refugees seeking sanctuary. She fined me for washing my car too loudly, one said. She claimed the sound of the hose violated noise harmony. She fined me because my headlights were too assertive, another added. She said they glared at her when I drove past. She fined me for insufficient wheel humility, said a third. She said my tires looked arrogant. Wheel humility. That was a new one. The creativity of Karen's violations never ceased to amaze me. It hit me then that Karen was not just spiraling. She was dragging the whole neighborhood into her vortex. She was creating an atmosphere of fear and confusion. People were afraid to park their cars, or wash them, or even drive through the neighborhood without wondering what arbitrary violation they might trigger. But the good news was that every ridiculous fine, every fake regulation, every desperate power grab was more evidence. Evidence that would end her presidency. Evidence that would end her crusade against my truck. Evidence that would ultimately bring her face to face with real legal consequences. And by Fridays, meeting the neighborhood would no longer be under the rule of a clipboard tyrant. Karen did not know it yet, but she was about to lose everything she had built, and all because she believed she had the right to open my truck with a shiny brass key. I arrived at the HOA meeting 30 minutes early, not because I was eager to watch Karen implode, but because the board had specifically asked me to help set up the projector, seats, and the security measures. Not physical security, emotional security. They knew Karen well enough to expect some kind of theatrical meltdown. And the last thing anyone wanted was her climbing onto a table again and shouting about vehicular insurrection. The community center was already humming with quiet tension. People whispered in small clusters. Some clutched copies of the Mobility Harmony packet like evidence in a courtroom. Others held their phones up with screenshots of fines Karen had sent at random hours. One guy had printed an 18 by 24 poster of the bogus wheel humility violation and taped it to the wall with the caption, "How is this real?" Even I had to stop and admire it. Jill approached me nervously with a clipboard in hand. Her hair was pulled back in a tight, stressed-out bun. The bun of someone who had hit her HOA limit. "She does not know what we are planning," she whispered. "She will know in about 20 minutes, I replied. Jill nodded sharply. Good, the board is united. That has not happened in 10 years. She has finally managed to unite everyone against her. That is what happens when tyranny arrives, in orthopedic sandals. She choked back a laugh. Stay close when we begin. She is going to make this difficult. Oh, I knew. Karen did not breathe without making something difficult. The residents filed in, some taking seats, others leaning against the walls like spectators at a boxing match. The room smelled faintly of coffee, anxiety, and mild resentment, all standard HOA aromas. Everyone was waiting for the show, and right on cue, the door slammed open. Karen swept in like royalty entering a coronation ceremony. She wore her navy blazer and tan slacks. The fake earpiece was back. Her clipboard rested on her forearm like a sacred artifact, and she carried a stack of her mobility council packets tucked under the other arm, ready for distribution. The room groaned collectively. There will be order, she announced to the assembled crowd. It has not started yet, someone muttered. She ignored them. Instead, she marched to the front of the room and planted herself beside the podium. She glared at the board members seated at the table as though daring them to challenge her. Jill stepped forward. Thank you all for coming. Tonight's meeting will address some important community matters. I will be handling tonight's meeting, Karen interrupted. Given the heightened threat level to neighborhood vehicular harmony, I must take control of these proceedings. No, Jill said sharply. You could feel the room freeze. The single word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Karen blinked. She was taken aback. She was not used to that word. No one ever said no to her. No one ever challenged her authority directly. No, she repeated. That is correct, Jill said firmly. The board will handle this meeting. You will sit down. Karen's jaw dropped so far it almost unhinged. Sit down. Yes, Jill said in the audience, like everyone else. Karen's eyes snapped toward me, searching for backup, looking for someone to validate her position. But I simply folded my arms and leaned against the wall. I was not here to save her. I was here to observe, document, and allow her to destroy her own argument. I am the HOA president, Karen hissed. For now, someone in the back whispered. Karen spun around. Who said that? No one answered. Jill cleared her throat. Please take your seat, Karen. Karen did not move, not at first, but her. Jill cleared her throat. Please take your seat, Karen. Karen did not move, not at first, but her face contorted through a series of expressions that would have made a soap opera actress jealous. Shock melted into disbelief. Disbelief twisted into fury. Fury softened briefly into what almost looked like fear before hardening back into that familiar self-righteous indignation that had terrorized the neighborhood for years. The silence in the community center was so thick you could have sliced it with one of her laminated violation notices. Every eye in the room locked onto Karen as if watching a nature documentary about a predator, suddenly realizing it had become prey. Her knuckles whitened around her clipboard. The veins in her neck pulsed visibly beneath her pearl necklace. For a moment, I genuinely wondered if she might spontaneously combust from the sheer impossibility of being challenged in her own domain. You cannot silence me, she finally hissed through clenched teeth. I built this community. I maintained order when no one else would. I stood guard while the rest of you let chaos creep into our streets, our driveways, our very way of life. Someone in the back row coughed. It sounded suspiciously like the word delusional. Karen spun toward the sound, but couldn't identify the culprit. The crowd had grown unified in a way I had never witnessed before. Neighbors who barely spoke to each other now exchanged knowing glances. People who had been fined for absurd reasons, like aggressive lawn patterns and suspicious mailbox angles, now sat shoulder to shoulder ready to reclaim their sanity. Jill did not flinch. She had spent years absorbing Karen's abuse, and tonight she had finally found her spine. I said, sit down, Karen. This is not a request. This is a directive from the board. The board, Karen laughed, but there was no humor in it. The board exists because I allow it to exist. I handpicked every single one of you. I trained you. I gave you purpose. And now we are exercising that purpose, Jill replied calmly, by removing you. The gasp that escaped Karen's throat was almost theatrical. Remove me. You would remove the very heart of this neighborhood, the guardian of vehicular harmony, the protector of driveway decorum. Without me, you will descend into absolute pandemonium. I stepped forward slightly, not to intimidate, but to make my presence known. Karen, we have documentation of every false fine you issued, every fake organization you created, every attempt to collect money under fraudulent pretenses. The evidence is overwhelming. Evidence, she spat the word like it was poison. You call harassment evidence. You call persecution documentation. I was trying to save this community from your truck, your shadow, your entire existence. My truck, I repeated slowly. You are facing potential criminal charges because you could not accept that my truck existed in your field of vision. It was a threat, she shrieked. Every day I had to look at it sitting there in your driveway, mocking me with its chrome and its badge and its unapologetic presence. Do you have any idea what that did to my peace of mind? Several people in the audience exchanged bewildered looks. This was the confession they never expected. Karen was admitting that her entire crusade stemmed not from legitimate community concerns, but from personal obsession. Mark, my neighbor with the two red cars, stood up. You fined me $200 because my car was visually aggressive. I painted it that color because my daughter picked it out before she passed away. It was her favorite color. The room fell silent. Karen blinked. Well, I did not know that. You did not ask, Mark said, his voice cracking slightly. You never asked anyone anything. You just assumed you were right and everyone else was wrong. Another neighbor stood. You find me for insufficient wheel humility. I still do not know what that means. Then another. You tried to have my motorcycle removed because it looked rebellious. And another. You measured my driveway shadow at 3 different times of day to prove I was creating visual disruption. The testimonies poured out like water from a broken dam. Years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. Karen stood frozen at the front of the room, watching her kingdom crumble with every new accusation. I tried to help, she whispered, but her voice had lost its power. I was only trying to maintain standards. Standards, Jill repeated. You created imaginary violations and demanded payment for them. You attempted to collect hundreds of dollars through fake organizations. You called 911 on the county sheriff because he would not give you a key to his truck. These are not standards, Karen. These are delusions. Karen's eyes darted around the room, searching for a single ally. There were none. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had once brought Karen casseroles during particularly aggressive enforcement campaigns, refused to meet her gaze. Fine, Karen said suddenly, straightening her blazer. If this is how you want to play it, then fine. I will take my expertise elsewhere. There are other communities that would appreciate someone with my dedication, my vision, my commitment to harmony. She gathered her clipboard and a stack of mobility council packets. She adjusted her fake earpiece with exaggerated dignity, and she marched toward the door like a general retreating from a lost battle. But before she reached the exit, she turned one final time. This is not over, she declared, pointing directly at me. You think you have won, but you have only delayed the inevitable. Order will prevail. Harmony will return. And when this neighborhood collapses into chaos without me, you will all come crawling back begging for my guidance. No one responded. Karen shoved open the door and disappeared into the night. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a blanket. Years of tyranny had ended in a single evening. A decade of fear had evaporated in less than an hour. Then slowly, tentatively, someone started clapping. It spread through the room like wildfire. People who had been strangers moments ago now cheered together. Neighbors embraced. Someone actually popped a bottle of champagne they had apparently brought just in case. Jill approached me with tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said. We could not have done this without your documentation, without your patience. I shook my head. You did this. The whole community did. I just kept records. She laughed. Very thorough records. The celebration continued well into the night. People shared their own Karen stories, trading horror tales like war veterans comparing scars. The violations grew more absurd with each telling. Someone claimed Karen had once tried to fine them for having a garage door that squeaked with hostile intent. Another swore she had been cited for owning a car that was too beige and therefore psychologically numbing. I slipped out around 10:30. The night air was cool and crisp, and the stars were brighter than they had been in months. Maybe that was my imagination. Maybe relief just makes everything look better. As I walked toward my truck, I noticed something on the ground near my driver's side tire. A small laminated card had been dropped there. I picked it up and read it under the streetlight. Official HOA Master Key Authorization. Bearer has universal access to all community vehicles for emergency purposes. Signed, K. Allen. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I tucked it into my pocket, evidence for the file. The drive home was peaceful. No flashing lights in my rearview mirror. No angry figure waving a clipboard in my driveway. Just the quiet hum of the engine and the gentle glow of porch lights welcoming me back. But I knew this was not truly over. People like Karen do not simply disappear. They relocate. They rebrand. They find new communities to control and new neighbors to terrorize. Somewhere out there, another neighborhood was about to learn what we had survived. And part of me almost felt sorry for them. The next few weeks brought a kind of peace I had almost forgotten was possible. The neighborhood transformed without Karen's constant surveillance. People relaxed in ways they had not allowed themselves to relax in years. Mark repainted his car an even brighter shade of red just because he could. The Hendersons installed a basketball hoop in their driveway without filing 17 forms of approval. Someone even started a community garden in the vacant lot that Karen had once declared a potential vehicular hazard zone. I focused on my own property for the first time in months, repaired the fence, painted the shutters, replaced the motion sensor lights that had worked overtime documenting Karen's midnight surveillance missions. My son stopped by every few days to check on me. He never said it directly, but I could tell he was relieved the situation had resolved without escalating further. As chief deputy, he had seen enough neighborhood disputes turn violent. This one had ended with paperwork and public embarrassment rather than tragedy. Any word on her case? He asked one afternoon as we sat on my porch drinking iced tea. Hernandez is handling it, I replied. Fraud charges are being considered. The fake organizations the payment demands the unauthorized collection of fees. It adds up. He nodded, and the harassment charges. Still pending. Multiple residents filed complaints. The DA is reviewing everything. He set down his glass. You know, she is probably already doing this somewhere else. I know. Does that bother you? I thought about it. Honestly, no. Some lessons cannot be taught. They can only be experienced. Whatever community Karen lands in will have to learn for themselves who she really is. He smiled slightly. That is surprisingly philosophical for a retired sheriff. I am not retired, I reminded him. Just off duty. He laughed, and we sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun dip below the tree line. The formal legal proceedings began 6 weeks after Karen's removal. I was called as a witness, which felt strange given my position. Normally, I was the one presenting evidence, not providing testimony, but the situation demanded it. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Karen sat at the defendant's table wearing a conservative grey suit that I had never seen before. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her expression was carefully neutral. Gone was the theatrical outrage. In its place was something almost calculated. She was performing reasonableness. Her attorney was a young man who looked fresh out of law school. He shuffled papers nervously and avoided eye contact with the prosecution. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. The charges were read aloud. Harassment, fraud, falsifying documents, operating an unlicensed entity, attempted collection of unauthorized fees. Each one landed in the courtroom like a small explosion. Karen showed no reaction. She stared straight ahead as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand and placed my hand on the Bible. The oath felt heavier than usual. The prosecutor was a woman named Sandra Chen. Sharp eyes, sharper questions. She guided me through the timeline of events, starting with the morning Karen tried to open my truck with her master key. "Can you describe what you observed that morning?" she asked. I stepped onto my porch at approximately 7:12 a.m., I said, keeping my voice steady. The defendant was standing beside my vehicle attempting to insert a brass key into the driver's side door lock. And what happened next? She noticed me and immediately became confrontational. She claimed all vehicles in the neighborhood must allow HOA emergency access. When her key failed to work, she called 911 and reported me as a suspicious individual refusing a mandatory safety inspection. Did she know who you were at that time? No, she did not realize I was the county sheriff until Deputy Ray arrived and informed her. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Karen's attorney shifted uncomfortably. Sandra continued, "And what happened after that incident?" The defendant began an escalating campaign of harassment. She issued dozens of unauthorized fines for violations that do not exist in any HOA bylaw. She placed a wheel clamp on my vehicle. She attempted to have my truck towed by falsely claiming it was abandoned. She erected physical barriers on my property. She created fraudulent organizations and attempted to collect payment from residents. I presented the evidence: photographs, documents, screenshots, recordings, 3 binders worth of Karen's handiwork spread across the courtroom like an exhibition of bureaucratic insanity. Karen's attorney attempted a cross-examination, but his heart was not in it. He asked weak questions about my motives and my personal feelings toward his client. I answered each one calmly and factually. "Were you personally offended by my client's actions?" he asked. "I was personally inconvenienced," I replied, "but my feelings are irrelevant. The evidence speaks for itself." He had no follow-up. Other witnesses testified throughout the day. Mark described the emotional impact of being fined for his daughter's favorite color. Jill detailed years of board meetings dominated by Karen's increasingly irrational demands. Neighbors recounted violations for shadow angles and tire positioning and visual aggression. By the end of the proceedings, the picture was complete. Karen had constructed an elaborate fantasy of authority and wielded it like a weapon against anyone who dared to exist outside her control. The judge was an older man named Harrison. He had seen countless cases in his career, but even he seemed slightly bemused by the absurdity of this one. "Ms. Allen," he said, addressing Karen directly, "the evidence presented today paints a troubling picture. You created fictitious organizations to collect money from residents. You issued fines with no legal basis. You harassed a law enforcement officer and his vehicle. You trespassed on private property multiple times. And when confronted, you escalated rather than reflecting on your behavior." Karen finally spoke. "Your Honor, I was simply trying to protect my community. Everything I did was in service of harmony and order." The judge shook his head. "Ms. Allen, there is a significant difference between community service and community control. What you describe as protection, others describe as persecution. The court finds your actions troubling and your lack of remorse concerning." He shuffled his papers. "Given the circumstances and the volume of evidence, I am ordering the following: a restraining order preventing you from contacting any resident of the Bluff Creek neighborhood, a fine of $3,000 for attempted fraud, 100 hours of community service to be served under supervision, and mandatory counseling to address your relationship with authority and boundaries." Karen's jaw dropped. "Counseling," she repeated. "You are ordering me to receive counseling?" "Yes, Ms. Allen, because somewhere along the way you lost sight of where your authority ended and other people's rights began. Perhaps professional guidance can help you find that line again." She opened her mouth to argue, but her attorney placed a hand on her arm. For once, she stayed silent. The gavel came down. Court adjourned. I walked out of the courtroom into the afternoon sunlight. Sandra Chen caught up with me on the steps. "Thank you for your testimony, Sheriff," she said. "It made a significant difference." "I hope it helps," I replied. And I hope she actually gets the help she needs." Sandra raised an eyebrow. "That is generous of you considering everything she put you through." I shrugged. Holding grudges takes energy. I would rather spend that energy on things that matter. She smiled and shook my hand. "Take care, Sheriff." I drove home with the windows down. The breeze carried the smell of fresh cut grass and blooming flowers. Summer was approaching, and the neighborhood felt alive in a way it had not felt in years. That evening I sat on my porch and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My truck sat peacefully in the driveway. No wheel clamps, no orange flags, no laminated threats tucked under the windshield wiper. Just a vehicle, just a driveway, just a home. Jill stopped by with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses. She did not need to explain why she was there. We had all been through something together, and sometimes surviving something creates bonds that words cannot describe. "To peace," she said, raising her glass. "To normal driveways," I replied. We clinked glasses and laughed. It felt good to laugh. Months passed. The neighborhood continued to heal. Leonard proved to be a reasonable HOA president. His style was collaborative rather than dictatorial. He actually listened to residents. He actually compromised. Imagine that. The community garden flourished. Someone installed a little free library near the mailboxes. Block parties became regular events rather than rare occurrences. Children played in streets that had once felt like surveillance zones. I kept my binders of evidence stored in a closet, not because I expected to need them again, but because some experiences deserve to be remembered. Future generations of this neighborhood should know what we survived. They should know what happens when one person decides their vision of order matters more than everyone else's freedom. One afternoon, I received a letter with an unfamiliar return address. The handwriting was neat and precise, almost too precise. I opened it carefully. "Dear Sheriff," the letter began, "I'm writing to inform you that I have relocated to a new community, the Willow Springs development approximately 30 miles south of your current residence. I'm starting fresh here with new neighbors who appreciate structure and guidance. I have learned from my previous experiences, and I am committed to being a more effective leader. I wanted you to know that despite our differences, I harbor no ill will. You were simply an obstacle that needed to be navigated. I have navigated around you now. The new community welcomes my vision. They are eager for harmony. They understand the importance of vehicular compliance and driveway aesthetics. I am confident that this fresh start will allow me to achieve everything I was unable to achieve in Bluff Creek. Sincerely, Karen Allen. P.S. Your truck still bothers me." I read the letter 3 times. Then I set it down and stared out the window. Part of me wanted to warn Willow Springs. Part of me wanted to call the local authorities and give them a heads up about what was coming their way. Part of me wanted to forward the letter to every resident in that new development with a note that simply said run. But I did not. Because Karen was right about one thing. Some obstacles need to be navigated. And sometimes the best way to navigate is to let people discover the truth for themselves. Willow Springs would learn, just like we did. And when they finally realized who Karen truly was, they would find their own Jill, their own Mark, their own community of fed-up neighbors ready to reclaim their sanity. That is how these stories always end. Not with dramatic confrontations or explosive revelations. They end with regular people deciding they have had enough. They end with neighbors uniting against unreasonable authority. They end with clipboard tyrants running out of people willing to be tyrannized. I folded the letter and tucked it into the binder with everything else. Volume 5 of the Karen Chronicles, a postscript to an absurd chapter of my life. The sun set that evening like it had every evening before. The crickets sang their familiar songs. The porch creaked gently as I rocked in my chair. And somewhere 30 miles south, a new community was about to meet its future HOA president. I almost pitied them, almost. The following spring brought unexpected visitors. A young couple appeared at my door one Saturday morning looking nervous and hopeful. They introduced themselves as Marcus and Elena, new residents of Willow Springs. I invited them in for coffee. We heard about what happened here, Marcus said, stirring sugar into his cup, with the HOA president, the one who tried to take everyone's car keys. Word travels, I replied. Elena leaned forward. She is doing it again, in our neighborhood. It started small. Little notes about parking angles, suggestions about driveway materials. But now she is threatening people, demanding access to vehicles, creating fake committees with official-sounding names. I nodded slowly. Sounds familiar. We do not know what to do, Marcus said. The board is afraid of her. Nobody wants to speak up. But we found some articles online about what happened here, about you, about how the community fought back. I set down my coffee. What exactly are you hoping I can tell you? Elena's eyes were desperate. How did you stop her? What was the secret? I thought carefully before answering. There was no secret. We documented everything. We stayed calm when she escalated. We built a case based on facts, not emotions. And eventually, the community realized they had more power together than she had alone. Marcus slumped slightly. That sounds like it took years. It took patience, I admitted. But Karen's greatest weakness is her own behavior. She cannot help herself. She will always escalate. She will always cross lines. And when she does, you need to be ready with evidence. Elena pulled out her phone. We have been recording everything. Screenshots of her messages, photos of the barriers she puts up, videos of her confronting people in their driveways. Good, I said. Keep doing that. Create a timeline. Make copies. Share them with neighbors you trust. Build your coalition quietly before you move publicly. They listened intently as I walked them through the strategy, the importance of documentation, the value of patience, the power of unified community action. One thing I warned them: do not expect her to change. Do not expect an apology. Do not expect her to suddenly recognize what she has done wrong. People like Karen do not operate that way. Your goal is not to reform her. Your goal is to protect your community from her. Marcus nodded. And after we remove her, then what? Then you choose better leadership. You establish reasonable bylaws. You create a culture where residents feel heard rather than controlled. It takes time, but it is possible. Our neighborhood is proof. They left 2 hours later with pages of notes and renewed determination. I watched them drive away and felt a strange mixture of hope and sadness. Hope because they were not alone. Sadness because they were only the first. Karen would continue finding new communities, new victims, new kingdoms to build and ultimately destroy. But each time the pattern would repeat. She would rise, she would overreach, and eventually she would fall. That was the nature of people who mistook control for leadership. They always believed they were indispensable right up until the moment they discovered they were actually the problem. Summer arrived with its usual fanfare. Long days, warm nights, the smell of barbecue drifting through open windows. My son visited more frequently now that the Karen situation had resolved. We fished, we grilled, we sat on the porch and talked about everything and nothing. One evening, he asked a question I had been expecting for months. Dad, do you ever regret not handling it differently? He paused. I mean, you had authority. You could have shut her down immediately, made some calls, flexed your position. I watched the fireflies dance in the darkness before answering. I could have, but that would have been wrong. Why? Because authority is not a weapon. It is a responsibility. Using my position to crush someone who annoyed me would have made me no better than her. The whole point was to show that the rules apply equally. That accountability matters more than convenience. That justice should not depend on who you know or what title you hold. He was quiet for a moment. That is actually pretty wise. I am old, I said. Wisdom comes with the territory. He laughed. Fair enough. The conversation drifted to other topics. His work, his family, his plans for the future, normal things, precious things. As the night grew late and the stars emerged one by one, I realized something important. The Karen situation had been frustrating and exhausting and occasionally absurd, but it had also reminded me why I became a sheriff in the first place. Not for the authority, not for the power, not for the ability to tell people what to do. I became a sheriff because I believed in fairness, in accountability, in the idea that communities work best when everyone follows the same rules. Karen believed communities work best when everyone follows her rules. That was the fundamental difference between us, and that difference explained everything that happened. The letter from Willow Springs arrived 3 months later. Marcus and Elena had succeeded. Dear Sheriff, the letter began. We wanted to thank you for your advice. Following your guidance, we documented everything for 6 months. We built a coalition of 27 residents. Last week, we held a special board meeting and voted to remove Karen Allen as HOA president by a margin of 31-4. She did not take it well. She accused us of conspiring against her. She threatened lawsuits. She declared that Willow Springs would collapse into chaos without her leadership. But we stood firm. We had the evidence. We had the numbers. We had each other. She is gone now. Relocated again, apparently. We heard rumors about a new development called Pinehurst Estates about 50 miles west. Whoever lives there, we wish them luck. Thank you again for everything. You helped us remember that communities belong to the people who live in them, not the people who try to control them. I set the letter down and smiled. Pinehurst Estates, another neighborhood, another fresh start for Karen, another cycle beginning. But somewhere in that cycle was hope, because Marcus and Elena had learned, and they would teach others. And eventually, Karen would run out of communities willing to tolerate her. Or maybe she would not. Maybe she would spend the rest of her life hopping from HOA to HOA, leaving a trail of traumatized residents and absurd violations in her wake. Either way, it was no longer my problem. I had my porch, my truck, my peaceful neighborhood, and a binder full of memories that would make excellent stories for years to come. The sunset that evening was particularly beautiful. Shades of purple and gold stretched across the sky like a painting. I sat in my rocking chair and listened to the sounds of children playing down the street. Normal sounds, peaceful sounds, the sounds of a community that had survived its storm and emerged stronger on the other side. And if you are reading this or listening to this wondering what I would do differently, I have one answer. Nothing. Every frustration, every ridiculous violation, every midnight encounter with a woman in a reflective vest measuring my driveway shadow, all of it led here, to this moment, to this peace. Some stories end with dramatic victories. Others end with quiet evenings and the knowledge that you did the right thing even when it was hard. This is the second kind of story. And honestly, those are the best ones. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever dealt with someone like Karen? Someone who believed their authority extended far beyond its actual limits. Someone who created chaos in the name of order. Drop your stories in the comments below. Share your experiences. Let the community know they are not alone. And if you are currently living under the thumb of a clipboard tyrant, take heart. Document everything. Build your coalition. Stay patient. Your victory is coming. Subscribe for more stories like this one. Real accounts of ordinary people standing up against unreasonable authority. Tales of neighborhoods reclaiming their sanity, one HOA meeting at a time. Because communities belong to the people who live in them, not the people who try to control them. Thank you for reading. And remember, no one has the right to a master key to your life.